Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our August 2018 monthly webinar. I want to thank you all for joining us. We're excited to be starting our academic year with one of our cultural leadership mentors, Erik Pavia, who will be leading us through his talk, The University of Adversity, today. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Erik Pavia. Erik Pavia is a business executive in the software industry and a teacher at the University of Texas at El Paso. He was born and raised in El Paso, where he received a BBA from UTEP, and he also received a JD from Stanford in 2013. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Erik.
Cool. Can you all see that, or can you see the slides, Lydia?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Great. So thank you all for taking the time to let me give this presentation to you all. As Lydia mentioned, the title of this presentation is The University of Adversity. And what it stems from is this idea that growing up with difficulties or with challenges can give people and students some great learning experiences. So this is one of my favorite quotes from John D. Rockefeller. And if you read the quote, you see that he doesn't describe his struggle early in life as a deficit. He actually calls it a blessing. John D. Rockefeller, of course, grew up to be one of the most successful men in industry, and he had a very tough childhood, and he credits a lot of his success to the difficulties that he had growing up. So a bit more detail about myself. I'm the founder of a small seed stage company. Prior to that, I was the fourth employee at a startup that I helped scale from 4 employees and maybe $500,000 in financing to 30 employees and 14 million in funding. I got a JD from Stanford, but while I was getting my education, I decided that being a lawyer wasn't for me, and I decided to go into business instead. So I've been working in the software tech industry since 2013. Along the way, I decided that I wanted to give back to my community in some way. So I reached out to the University of Texas at El Paso, where I got my bachelor's degree, and I asked if there was some way that I could get involved. So I didn't have a whole lot of money to donate, so I asked if I could donate my time, and they agreed to let me become a teacher. So I've been teaching courses at the university on startup law, essentially, so corporate law, for about 3 years now. And I've learned a lot about the student population. For those who aren't familiar, UTEP and El Paso generally are, what a lot of people would consider underprivileged communities. So some demographics information about El Paso. We have, I think the median income here is something about like $35,000 per family. We have relatively low high school and college attainment levels. I think only about 16% of the population gets a college education or higher. My own personal upbringing was very in line with the demographics. I'm first generation American, first generation college graduate. I often joke that I'm first generation not to get arrested with possession with intent to sell. I very much grew up understanding what the community was like, and going and becoming a teacher has allowed me to connect with students to put myself back in that position of what it's like to grow up in one of these underprivileged communities and to attend a school that's doesn't have the same in the way of resources as some other places might have. So I've gotten to connect with students on this quite a bit, and I've learned that there are a few lessons from my time working with entrepreneurs and startups that map quite well onto the student experience in these types of communities. And namely, this is because being an entrepreneur is really hard. So entrepreneurs earn 35% less money over a 10-year period than they could have earned in a regular paid job. On top of that, 75% of venture capital backed companies don't generate a return for their founders. So if you go out and you start a company and you sell it for millions of dollars, oftentimes none of those millions of dollars go back to the person who started the company. Only a quarter of the time do any of the founders generate a return. There's a great quote that says entrepreneurs are people who are willing to work 80 hours to avoid working 40. And it's generally the case that when you go and start a company, it's a lot harder than just going out and getting a regular job. So at the end of the day, it takes a lot of grit to become an entrepreneur. And I think you can take a lot of the lessons. I've been able to take a lot of the lessons from these hardworking, struggling entrepreneurs and apply them to my students and kind of help them understand that some of the challenges that they faced in their upbringings and in their backgrounds are actually some assets. So where does that asset-minded thinking come from? And I think for a lot of entrepreneurs, it comes from being able to see challenges as opportunities. And that's one of the things that I try to share with my students, is that what for some people might just be a hurdle to overcome may often be an opportunity that they can take advantage of. So if you're from the South or from anywhere in the desert and you haven't read the book Dune, I highly recommend it. So it's a science fiction book, I think from the 1950s or 60s, about a family who gets outcast to this sort of resource poor desert planet. And one of my favorite quotes from this book is that polish comes from the cities and wisdom comes from the desert. And so I think, as you look at your student populations, or at least as I look at my student populations, there are a lot of lessons from entrepreneurs and from the desert that, kind of help explain where some of this grit comes from. So even just looking at the desert, living in the desert is incredibly difficult. I always like to say that, not only does the sun burn, whenever it rains, it floods, the wind stings, the plants stab, and the animals poison. When you're in the desert, absolutely everything is out to get you. And there's some wisdom that this breeds in people. So I've noticed that there's certain characteristics of people from our communities that come from these underprivileged or disadvantaged backgrounds. Some of this stems from people being first generational. This causes people to be very self-starting. A lot of people are often resource constrained, and I'll talk about these all in a little bit more detail. And this leads to a certain level of humility. So starting with first generationalness. So there's something about being first generational that I think is incredibly powerful. As it relates to our startups, this is very applicable because every successful startup does something new. And by something new, I mean, maybe they've invented a new technology, maybe they've invented a new business process that nobody else has used before, and that gives them a competitive advantage. And for our first generational people, this is something that they're very familiar with because new is the way of life. I always say for people from El Paso, it's really hard to find someone who isn't first generation something. People here are either first generation American, they're first generation college graduates, they might be first generation professionals, they might be first generation English speakers, they might be first generation El Pasoans. And I think the same is true for many of the communities along the border throughout Texas and in many other parts of this country. And when new is the way of life, everything is new for you, right? You're very used to going out, doing things for the first time. You're not necessarily used to having people show you the way, and this leads to some of the kind of the characteristics that allow for people to be very successful in entrepreneurship, because they're not, they don't have expectations for how things should go. And so not having expectations might sound like it's not necessarily a good thing, but I think it actually is. I always compare growing up in the desert to being like Luke Skywalker. So if you haven't watched Star Wars, maybe this reference is not going to click, but in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker lives on Tatooine in the middle of nowhere. He says if there's a bright center to the galaxy, Tatooine is the planet that it's farthest from. And he's totally disconnected from all of the political happenings in the broader galaxy. He's just got no clue about the war with the Empire. He's got no clue about the revolution, and this actually ends up being a benefit for him because when it comes time to go and do the raid on the Death Star, Luke Skywalker is one of the few people who volunteers for what's essentially a suicide mission. And the only reason he's able to do so is because he actually doesn't really know what he's getting himself into. The entire time that he's on his like crazy adventure, he only really makes that attempt because if he knew what he was actually getting himself into, he probably wouldn't have done it. And the thing is that when you're an entrepreneur or when you're a person growing up in one of these underprivileged communities, the odds are stacked against you. And they're so stacked against you that the only way oftentimes in which you can challenge those odds is by not knowing what those odds actually are. This is another one of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain. He has this great quote that says that people, they did not know it was impossible, and so they did it. So this is often a great benefit for people growing up with these backgrounds is they don't know what the challenges are ahead of them because again, it's their first time going. Everything is new to them. They've never experienced this stuff before. Nobody's there to tell them what's possible and what isn't. And so sometimes they don't know what's impossible, and they go ahead and make it an attempt and accidentally succeed. The challenge here with students and with people from these communities is that not only do they not know what's impossible, sometimes people don't know what's possible, right? They don't know what are the options available for them because they've got no models, right? If you're doing something for the very first time, if you're first generation something, that means you're the first person to do it. There's nobody to look up to. There's no worn path for you to follow, and there's nobody for you to imitate. And so one of the things that I think is really valuable is explaining to students that all of the great things that have been done by humans in history were done by other people that are, flesh and blood just like them. And I think, one of the most important pieces of being a mentor and of being a teacher has less to do with the content that you teach your students and more to do with the model that you set or the models that you present to people to show them what's possible. I think there's something about human nature where if we don't see other people doing it, it's really hard for us to put ourselves in those shoes and to imagine ourselves doing those things. And we do have the internet and television, and so we can see these people throughout the rest of the world achieving great things. But oftentimes it's hard to connect with them as flesh and blood. This is there are phenomenon that are kind of studied very heavily about how people don't see celebrities as other people. We almost see them as these types of gods. And so the more that we can show students that everybody's who's doing amazing things as human just like them, I think the more models they'll have for success. So being first generational leads people to be self-starters. And this is a great benefit for entrepreneurs as well as for first generational people because you're very likely to go out and start doing amazing things on your own. It's kind of related to the idea of not knowing that things are impossible. So one of the co-founders of PayPal, the software company that makes payment processing services, explains why immigrants are great entrepreneurs. And he says that immigrants are long in ambition and short on things to lose. And this is really interesting because when you read about great investors, one of the trends that people like Ray Dalio and Warren Buffett, one of their kind of core investment principles is that they really only make investments when there's a small downside and a big upside. So looking at the profile of our immigrant entrepreneurs, you don't have a lot to lose and you have a lot to gain. That's generally a great investment to make. So I think our kind of underprivileged populations, our underprivileged students and our entrepreneurs, they're generally great. They're very valuable to invest in because oftentimes there's just like not much to lose for those people. These types of people, they're willing to work really hard. They're not going to take handouts. They're gonna make it on their own. They're gonna be self-starters. Except one of the challenges here is that, you know, because they take no handouts, they often also take no help. Um, so I know personally when I was growing up, my parents taught me that, you know, I needed to be self-sufficient. I needed to do things on my own. I needed to strike out on my own. And it was bad to go out and ask people for favors. Um, and I think this is actually really problematic thinking, because when you take no help, you end up investing a lot of time and a lot of effort in reinventing the wheel. Reinventing the wheel, of course, is never a good thing. It's bad to go out and rebuild things that have already been built. So one of the things that I try to teach my students, and you know, that I try to teach other entrepreneurs that I work with, is it's never bad to ask for help, and oftentimes asking for help speeds up your progress significantly, because you don't have to beat your head against the walls trying to solve something that's already been solved. Another benefit, you know, that I've seen entrepreneurs and people from the desert kind of flip is from being a drawback to a benefit, is the fact that they're resource constrained. Again, this doesn't sound like something that is a positive characteristic to have, or something to be proud of, or to see as being good. But I think there's a great benefit in being resource constrained. So Noam Wasserman is a professor at Harvard Business School, and he does a lot of research on what makes successful entrepreneurs and successful startups. And his definition of an entrepreneur is or a founder is an individual who starts a new organization to pursue opportunities without regard to the resources they currently control. And I honestly think this sounds a lot like some of the students that I work with when I teach at UTEP. These are people who are out trying to accomplish things without necessarily looking at what it is that's within their control or not. They don't care if they're coming from, you know, like a poor family or an impoverished family. Oftentimes they're willing to go out and stretch themselves out to try to make it in whatever it is that their interests are in. So when you look at a startup, you know, there's often a question of you know, what makes a startup a startup? What makes a startup different from any other business? And I think what makes a startup special is that they're actually very resource constrained. So, you know, your startups don't have a lot of cash. They don't have a lot of institutional knowledge or expertise. Usually it's a handful of people. You don't have a team of executives putting together the company business model. It's you know, might be a guy in his garage, or a kid in their college dorm. They don't have a lot of talent. Their teams are really small, so they don't have a lot of people contributing to the development. And they don't have a lot of market power, right? When you're a startup, you're first getting started, you don't, you know, you're not going to be able to set prices in the market. Nobody's going to know who you are. And so all of these sound like challenges, but the great benefit that they provide to these companies is that these companies have a lot less entrenched interests. So if you think about a massive company, when a massive company tries to do something different or novel, it's often very difficult for them, right? Because they have a lot of entrenched interests in just doing things the way that they've always been done. A startup doesn't have that. That allows them to make very quick decisions. They have a lot of flexibility in their operations, their product development, and they can make decisions very, very quickly. So people often see startups as very risky, right? Entrepreneurs are taking these massive risks, and they see it almost as a negative. But I think instead of seeing it as a negative, you can see it as a positive, which is that startups not only must take risks, they're allowed to take risks. They can take the risks that many other companies can't take. And again, kind of mapping this to our students, you know, I see a lot of students coming from more privileged backgrounds who, oddly enough, are less willing to take chances than the students who've come up from, you know, underprivileged backgrounds. One of my favorite stories was in law school. There was one of my classmates was you know, he was applying for these judicial clerkships, and the judicial clerkship application process is a very onerous one. He printed out, you know, hundreds of copies of his resume and was stuffing envelopes in the library for, you know, days, nights, weeks on end. And you know, you'd ask this guy, like, you know, why do you care so much about getting one of these clerkships? And you know, his answer was, well, my grandfather was a a Stanford law graduate who became a judge, and my father was a Stanford law graduate who became a judge, and I feel I have to do the same thing. And he wasn't willing to, question whether that was something that he should be doing or not. So I think it's a great opportunity, for a lot of our students. They're not tied to anything, and they can really pursue aggressive challenges and aggressive dreams in what they're trying to achieve. Um, One of the challenges is that some of these students don't necessarily minimize the amount of risk they're taking. So they'll take these crazy risks, but they'll go all in. So I often see students that will they will go to college. They'll be enrolled in college full time, and they're not willing to get themselves into debt, and so they'll work a full-time job on top of their full-time class load, and they're just spreading themselves very thin and almost working too hard, because they're not willing to go all in on making sure that their classes are or that they're getting good grades on their classes, right? Maybe they have to work, or maybe they're just afraid of debt. There's a very valuable lesson that I've kind of learned from other entrepreneurial thinkers. So Mark Andreessen is a venture capitalist. He was the founder of Netscape, which was one of the early internet browsers. And he says that when he invests in companies, he looks at various layers of risk that the company might have. So I won't read them all off. You can read them, but as you can see, startups are very risky, right? There's tons of different types of risk here. And one of the things that I try to teach my students is that going out and starting a company isn't about taking on all of these risks for yourself. Really, what it's about is taking selective risk. So I think one of the challenges that I find that students face is they don't ask for help. They try to do everything on their own, and they don't try to mitigate the risks that they're taking on, because they kind of have to, they feel they have to swing for the fences. So one of the things that I try to teach them is ask for help, don't reinvent the wheel, and try to focus on what's really important at any given time, so that you're not spreading yourself too thin. The last characteristic I want to talk about that I think is really powerful, that comes from growing up in these underprivileged communities, and again, that's really powerful for entrepreneurs, is humility. So there's a great book called Daily Rituals, which maps the daily habits of some of the great thinkers, artists, scientists, entrepreneurs in history. And the author, Mason Curry, he went through and did a lot of research on all of these people and what their day-to-day lives were like. And he said his one takeaway from having studied all these successful people was that their grand creative visions translate to small daily increments. So these people weren't waking up one day and achieving something spectacular. Their great achievements were based on small daily increments. They just got up every day and they did a little bit of work. This is a very common phrase that people say is, don't lose the forest for the trees, keep your eye on the ball, look at the big picture. But I think one thing that I've learned in working at a startup is that the big picture is really important, but it's really based on all of the details. You don't necessarily have to focus on not losing the forest for the trees. Sometimes somebody needs to go and plant those trees in the first place. One of my role models in life was this attorney. He was an attorney at a Silicon Valley law firm. He was one of the best attorneys in the country, probably representing companies like Dropbox and Twitter. And I sat down with him for lunch one day and I said, hey man, how did you become so successful? What did you do? And his response was, how do you become successful? You just do the fucking work. There's no secret to success. It's just sitting down to get to work every day, which kind of ties into this great Shakespeare quote: "Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them." For many of our students and for many entrepreneurs, you're not necessarily born great, right? You might be born to one of these underprivileged backgrounds, and very few people have greatness thrust upon them. We're not necessarily in war right now, or we have a Churchill moment where this stuff just kind of gets put on us. So I think the people that we work with and other entrepreneurs, they have to achieve their greatness. And the way that they do this is by doing the work. And I think this is something that you'll find is very prevalent in underprivileged communities. Is people are really willing to do that work. I know one day I was at an internship and I was working late one day. I was at the office at like 11 p.m. and this was supposed to be a summer internship where it was supposed to be like fun and easy going. And I was complaining about the fact that I was stuck at the office till 11 p.m. And then I got to thinking, and I remembered, my dad wakes up at 4 a.m. every day to go work in the hot sun. And here I am sitting in a nice air conditioned office with like food delivery, and I'm complaining. And that humbled me and kind of refocused me and got me back to work. And I think you'll find that people in these communities keep that humility. They're willing to sit down, do the work that nobody else is willing to do. Of course, the challenge here is that some people are just too humble. They're too humble and they don't feel like they can achieve great things. They don't realize that they can go out and achieve that greatness. And so they might be willing to settle for lesser achievements or lesser positions. One of the things that I see from a lot of my students is they have this attitude of I'm just a kid from El Paso. And you contrast that with someone like Mark Zuckerberg. He was notorious for carrying around business cards in the early days of Facebook, where the business card said that I'm CEO, bitch, right? He had the attitude of being the boss. And sometimes we breed this attitude of I'm just a lowly kid in our schools. I went to a high school called Canotillo here in El Paso. When I was there, it was one of the worst schools in the state of Texas. Had one of the lowest performing. It was one of the lowest performing schools on it was the tax at the time, the minimum skills test. We had one of the highest absentee rates in the state of Texas, one of the highest dropout rates in the state of Texas. And my math teacher was a great supporter and one of my best teachers. And even he did a lot to kind of instill this idea in me that I was just another poor kid from El Paso. And so I think one responsibility that I see in myself as a teacher is to change this mindset. So I've covered a couple of things. Some people go out and achieve things because they don't know it's impossible, right? So they go out and they try, not necessarily because it's actually a good idea. They just don't know it's actually a bad idea. Some people don't even try because they don't think of it as a possibility. And some people don't try because they're too humble and they think they're stuck in this lowly position. So they think that whatever they want to go out and achieve is actually just impossible. And I think what I'm hoping to do as a teacher and what I hope the mindset changes into is that our students know that things are possible. So they're very actively aware that they can go out and achieve all of these things. The last little comment I'll make is I talk about role models as being important, and Bill Gates was one of my role models growing up. But I didn't see Bill Gates as a human. I saw him as this sort of mythological demigod, sitting in some non-existent office somewhere for a company called Microsoft. I didn't see him as a human. I couldn't really relate to him. Even looking at this picture, there's nothing about Bill Gates that really resonated with me as a kid from El Paso. And I think a lot of people, when they look at successful entrepreneurs and successful people in specific careers, there's a certain image about what they should be like. So this is the cast of the TV show Silicon Valley, and they all kind of fit this stereotypical pullover dweeb look. And for a lot of people, that just doesn't resonate. So one of the things that I think is really important as we go out and set ourselves as role models and find role models for students is to really embrace who we are as a population and as a community, and to not try to fit this mold of what success should look like. So I think it's really important to not only be a role model, but to be a role model that's authentic and one that students can empathize with, because otherwise it just feels too remote and too inaccessible. So that's it. That's the end of my presentation. Lydia, I actually don't know how to get away from Keynote. I don't know if you guys have any questions.
You're good. That's great. Thank you so much, Eric. Oh gosh, there's so much here. I was in the middle of writing a note actually when you finished. If you want, you can stop sharing your screen, and then you would just be sharing your webcam while we do Q&A. So, but that's up to you. There you go. Yeah.
Did I get it?
Okay,
Yeah. Great.
It's great. Thank you so much. So yeah, we do have some time for some Q&A for Eric. Again, if you have audio access either through your computer microphone or through your telephone, feel free just to use the hand raise feature on your GoToWebinar control panel, and I will unmute you so that you can speak to Eric directly. If you don't have audio access, feel free to type in a question and I can read it to Eric for you. So while folks are thinking, I have a couple of questions for you. One is about the gig economy. So I was at an academic conference a couple of years ago, and a panelist said that he quoted some study that said, you know, in the next 15 years, 80% of the economy is going to be driven by like the gig economy, right? And so I wonder how you see the relationship between these entrepreneurial assets, right, that come from adversity playing into, you know, this kind of gig economy where people are doing multiple things. Hopefully there are things that they're passionate about, but sometimes not, how you see those kind of relating, and if they could be the same assets kind of translating to that different sort of economic structure.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two components to the gig economy. One which is, I guess, semi-concerning, and one which could be potentially empowering. So there's a great idea, this concept. I don't remember which one of my friends said it. He said, technology is eating away our free time, essentially. So, traditionally people went to work 8 to 5, 9 to 5, whatever it might have been. They got home and they were done with work for the day, and they got to spend time with their families, they got to relax, and that was what economists call like leisure time, right? You had a certain amount of leisure baked into your life. And one of the issues, the concerning part of the gig economy to me is that people's leisure is being eaten away, because now you work your 9 to 5, and then it's really hard to make ends meet sometimes, and instead of going and spending time with your family, you end up picking up a shift on Uber, right? And sometimes that's a necessity of life. But I think where it's problematic is, and this is one thing that I try to teach my students is, sometimes it's really important to invest in skill development outside of work or outside of class. And usually the only time that you have to do that is after work or after class. And I think when people are, picking up these side gigs, not only are they giving up their leisure time, they're also giving up the time that they would have had otherwise to invest in their own personal development and growth. I know for me, the course valuable skills that I have was not stuff that I learned in the classroom or even on the job. It's the stuff that I learned at home after hours.
Yeah.
So one of the things I try to teach, kind of share with my students or encourage them to do is, instead of, it's the concept of opportunity cost. Sure, you might make $10 an hour, picking up a shift with Uber, but if you invest that time in learning a new skill or picking up some new knowledge, that knowledge and those skills compound, right? The $10 doesn't compound, but the knowledge and the skills do. So that's kind of the negative that I see about it. The good part of it that I see is when you do have those skills, the gig economy is translating decently well for some skilled jobs, right? So let's say you do want to develop a skill as a visual graphic designer, right? And that's a skilled labor. You don't necessarily have to go get a job with a design firm or a graphics firm. You don't have to be a full-time graphic designer to increase your abilities, you can pick up, little tasks on Fiverr or on 99 Designs or all these other places. So I think there is an opportunity for the skill development there. I think it gives people the ability to wear a lot of different hats, which can be valuable, but I am concerned about what it does to people's willingness to invest in themselves.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have a question now from Alejandra Polchik, who comes to us from Austin. Alejandra, I think we can hear you now.
Well, it's not, it's more than a question, as I want to congratulate Erik and go Miners. I am also from El Paso.
Nice.
And your presentation is so inspiring. I feel every description you gave about first generation students, I was just like nodding my head at yes, yes. This every point you make, I completely identify with that. And even though it's been more than 10 years that I graduated from my master's, I still feel new. I still feel I still feel like a foreigner, and I still feel like sometimes like I don't belong. But of course, this is not about me. Of course, this is of our students, and I can't imagine how our students feel when they are in the jungle of being entrepreneurs or being on the education field or being in any professional field. And I would like to talk with you more about doing a presentation for us, for Austin Community College. I think your presentation was very inspiring and to the point. Congratulations, Erik.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to share my email address with all of you. I don't know how to do that. Can I share that in the chat?
You should be able to. I can also share it via email after.
Okay, great. I just typed it in. I don't know if anyone can see it, but
is everyone able to see the chat? Oh, it just went to the organizers.
Okay. Alejandro, I'll make sure to get my email address to you. But yeah, I'm in Austin pretty frequently, so whenever I'm out there, I'd love to swing by and meet your students.
Thank you. We're making plans for the spring semester, and I have a lot of plans that I want to discuss with you, Lydia, and of course with Dr. Chavez. But I think, Erik, what you're saying is we have the tendency to be a little bit dramatic of our origins, and I like the way you explain it in a very objective way, and that's what we want to hear, from people who leave the subjectivity on the side and just tell it the way it is.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm definitely down to go do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have several questions coming in the questions pane. Arnoldo Conales from South Texas says, thank you for this presentation. It really resonates with me. My parents were entrepreneurs running a restaurant with virtually no education. Still managed to start a restaurant and run it for over 20 years till they retired. I became the only person in my family who graduated college thus far. Now I'm a student success specialist at South Texas College working with us and their students.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, if you have any great stories about your parents' entrepreneurial venture, I'd love to hear them. I mean, again, I don't know how I can put my email address up there, Lydia, but yeah, I'd love to stay in touch with everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. If you'd like, after the webinar, I can connect you with all the attendees.
Perfect.
Yeah, I can do that via email. And Maria Chavez, our CEO, says, first of all, thank you for joining us. And she would like to know, what was the turning point for you to achieve academically?
Well, so I think I had two turning points. The first one, I was always like one of those like nerdy kids in school who just like to read, and so school was always easy for me. But I think the first turning point I had, and these are both, I don't know, I think it's good to kind of get your ass kicked every now and then. I was in second grade, and up until second grade, I'd always been like the best math student without like any practice or work. And I met this kid who then became my best friend, who was just like way better at math than I was. And it was like a big wake up call that like, they're as lucky as you might be, they're just people who are luckier than you are. And I mean, I was also 7 years old, so it hit me probably harder than it should have. But it taught me to be very grateful for my natural abilities, but to also just be very aware that people are coming in at different abilities at all levels. And if you're lucky, it's good to be grateful. But if you're unlucky in something, it's also there's not a problem with it. I think the second big turning point in my academic career was my first year of law school. So I went into law school essentially treating law school like college number two, and they're very, very different beasts. And it was probably the worst year in my life. I got ridiculously sick. I had to get surgery. I picked up these terrible sleep disorders, and my girlfriend dumped me. It was just like a really, really bad time. And I think what that taught me was, as smart as I thought I was, it was significantly more valuable for me to be hardworking than it was to be smart. I'd always kind of, again, even after second grade, I kind of always coasted through school. It was never too challenging for me. And I would study, I'd do the work, but I never went above and beyond. And I would see some of the other students just like holed up in the library all day. And I realized, even if they weren't as sharp as I was, they had a lot more going for themselves because they had the work ethic. So it really made me turn my work habits around and not take, not just take the intelligence for granted. Like I realized that like being hardworking was just as important. I actually think it's more important to be hardworking than it is to be smart. So yeah, like I said, that was like the most important ass kicking I think I got in my life, and it definitely changed my perception of work and of intelligence.
Thank you. And from Karze Dubose, who also comes to us from Austin Community College, he says, great lecture. Erik, what strategies do you employ in your classes to get underrepresented students to be more confident? I ask because many minority students struggle with positive self-psychology building.
So I think one thing that I try to do is I try to be, so I mean, one, I'm Hispanic, and most of the students I work with are Hispanic. El Paso, I think, is like 70 or 80% Hispanic, and UTEP is representative of El Paso in a lot of ways. And so I think I'm relatable to the students, but I also try to eliminate as many barriers between them and myself as I possibly can, so that when they're in class, it feels more like a conversation than it does like a lecture. I know when I was a student, and I don't know when I got rid of this, but I always felt, I wouldn't want to say like an inferiority complex, but I always felt like the professor was somebody who I had to not just respect, which I think is fine. It was almost like I had to defer to them on all accounts. And I mean, I got very different educational experiences, because I got to go to UTEP, which has one of the lowest rejections rates, like highest admission rates in the country. And then I went to Stanford, which has the exact opposite. It's like the lowest admissions rate and the highest rejection rate in the country. And so I got to experience both, and it was backwards, because or my experience was a little bit counterintuitive, because when I was at UTEP, I always felt like the professors were there doing me a favor. And I never felt like I could go to the professors and ask for help and talk to them. Like, they were there in the classroom, and they were the professor, and I just needed to like shut up and listen. And I shouldn't go to office hours, because that was like brown nosing and being a kiss ass or whatever. And then when I got to Stanford, highly prestigious university, highly prestigious professors, some practice, like litigating in the Supreme Court and whatever, like billionaire professors. And they all did, and not that UTEP professors don't do this, but I would see students going to those professors for office hours and asking them questions after class. And those professors, there was a culture there of accessibility, and it really changed my perspective around, what is the role of a student at the university and what is the role of the university with the student. And the university is there to serve students. And it's not that UTEP didn't have that role. As a student, I just didn't realize that that was the university's job. I almost felt like, again, like they were doing me a favor. I didn't realize that they were there to help me. And so I start class within the first couple of hours of teaching. I make that point to the students, which is, I am here to serve you. You are my customers. You are paying the school for me to teach this class. Like, here's my email address here. If you want office hours, like, this is my assistant will schedule the office hours for you because I'm terrible at email management. The other thing I do is I make sure that, and I can do this, I guess, because I'm a little bit on the, like, I'm not a tenured faculty member, but I make sure I don't let them call me professor. I ask them to call me Erik. I try to humanize myself as much as possible so that I'm relatable, and again, it doesn't feel like I'm the lecturer at the podium. Like, I'm a guy who's coming from the same background as they are, to share my experiences and to teach them some stuff. Again, I'm not sure, what your kind of background is and what the school is like, but that to me has been pretty effective, because the students feel a lot more comfortable asking me questions and asking for help. And I wish more of them would take me up on office hours, but a decent amount of them do. And I know I didn't do a single office hours when I was in college.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that resonates with a lot of us. And our last question is from Deborah Macbeth, our Director of Communications and Engagement, who says, you spoke of role models. Did you have someone you would specifically say was your mentor?
I was terrible at seeking mentors when I was younger. Now I make a very active effort to do it. When I was growing up, I didn't ask people for help, and I thought I had to figure everything out on my own. So I had people that were role models that I looked up to and that I wanted to emulate, but I was too afraid and too intimidated to ask them for anything. So I think I struggled to have to procure mentors for myself. And kind of going back to the previous question, I actually do spend a lot of time in my class. It's a business law course, so there's nothing, like, I have no reason to do this other than I know the students need this. I do spend a lot of time explaining to students, again, it's one of the earlier lectures I give, how to find a mentor, how to develop a mentorship relationship, how to maintain a mentorship relationship, because it's not something that I necessarily knew how to do when I was younger. So I know that's not super helpful, but like, I actually, and that's not on the people around me. I just didn't know that was something I could do, and I never even attempted to do it.
Yeah, I think that actually is really helpful, because, one of the things that Catch the Next offers, the Ascender program offers to students, is a mentoring, component to the program. And very often we find that we have to do exactly what you're already doing in your class, right? Which is kind of cultivate that sensibility of what it means to have a mentor, and, what this kind of relationship is all about. And how to find, we match them with them, but thinking about spaces of opportunity for finding mentorships too, or finding mentors in different, in different places and in different sort of aspects of the educational and career journey.
I think one of the biggest things that I didn't understand as a student is that people want to help. I've never met a person of any success who doesn't want to give back. And even teaching my students at lesson, like, hey, the people around you, the older people, they want to give back. It makes them feel good. It feeds their ego a little bit, probably. I think that's also like a very valuable lesson, because I think people feel like they're a burden of sorts, and I don't think they realize that they're actually doing those other people a favor. One of my favorite lessons comes from Benjamin Franklin. And this has kind of been verified by like psychological studies. One of Benjamin Franklin's tactics if he wanted to get somebody to like him, was to ask them for a favor, which just sounds backwards, right? Because we think when we ask people for favors, we're being a burden. But he had a political rival. I forgot, it was like in the Philadelphia House or something, and there's this guy who just didn't like Benjamin Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin asked him to borrow his most prized collectible book, and he didn't read the book. He just took it for like a couple weeks and then gave it back to him. And what that did for for his rival was it got the rival invested in Benjamin Franklin's success. I think when you ask people for help, they somehow feel responsible for your success. Mm-hmm. And I found when personally, and when I help people, or when I ask for help, if I ask for help from someone, oftentimes they're the ones to follow up with me to be like, hey, did that piece of advice that I give you worked out? I think it's very valuable to explain to students that the mentorship relationship is very much a two-way relationship, and when it comes to the giving piece, right? The mentee is giving back to the mentor a lot of times just by allowing themselves to be mentored.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think that's a perfect note for us to end on. And as I said, I will follow up with an email to everybody who attended today to connect you with Erik. So everyone can, be in contact with him or have his information, have his email address. So thank you so much for sharing your time, Erik. I know you're a very busy person. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, and just thank you in general. Very grateful that you could be with us today.
I hope that was helpful for you and everyone else. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to me.
Absolutely. The pleasure's all ours. Thanks so much.
All right. Have a good one.